Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about what is clustering. So clustering is a very useful technique in unsupervised learning. So before we have learned supervised learning, and we focus on supervised learning methods such as regression and classification. So for supervised learning, in the setting of supervised learning, we can observe a set of features x, a set of features x1, x2 to xp. So this is a set of features. Besides the features, we also observe a response or a target variable y. And the purpose of supervised learning is to predict y using the combination of those features. So, however, clustering is a subject of unsupervised learning. In unsupervised learning, we only observe the set of features x1, x2 to xp, but there's no y. There's no y. So in unsupervised learning, we are not interested in prediction because we do not have a response variable y. So in unsupervised learning, we only have a x. So generally speaking, unsupervised learning is more subjective than supervised learning because in unsupervised learning, there is no simple goal for the analysis, such as prediction of a response. So unsupervised learning is very common in real life. So it is very important. For example, if we want to find out subgroups of breast cancer patients, we can use unsupervised learning to study their gene expression measurements. And we can also find some special groups of movies by the ratings assigned by movie viewers. The goals of unsupervised learning is to discover interesting things about the measurements. For example, we want to find out, is there an informative way to visualize the data? Or can we discover subgroups among the variables or among the observations? So mainly speaking, there are two methods in unsupervised learning. One is principal component analysis. The other one is clustering. Clustering is a broad class of methods for discovering unknown subgroups in data. For example, sometimes we want to find out subgroups of breast cancer patients, grouped by their gene expression measurements. Sometimes we want to find out subgroups of movies grouped by the ratings assigned by movie viewers. And there are several advantages for unsupervised learning. For example, it is often easier to obtain unlabeled data. For example, we can obtain unlabeled data from a lab instrument or a computer, and it is relatively difficult to obtain labeled data. Labeled data can be used for regression, but it is very difficult to obtain labeled data because labeled data require human intervention. Now we go to the definition of clustering. So later we are going to study principal component analysis, but today we focus on clustering. So what's the definition of clustering? Clustering refers to a very broad set of techniques for finding subgroups or clusters in a dataset. Formally speaking, we try to seek a partition of the data into distinct groups so that the observations within each group are quite similar to each other. Now you may ask me, so how can you define, what do you mean by similar? Okay, what do you mean by two or more observations are similar? So in this talk, we mainly use Euclidean distance to measure the similarity of two observations. And there are several other methods, but those methods are beyond the scope of this class. So clustering is very common in real life. For example, suppose now we have P measurements on N breast cancer patients, and the clustering can help us to find out some different unknown types of cancer, by clustering the data. There are two very useful clustering methods. One is k-means clustering. So in k-means clustering, we seek to partition the observations into a pre-specified number of clusters. But in hierarchical clustering, we do not know in advance how many clusters we want. In fact, we end up with a tree-like visual representation of the observations. So this is called a dendrogram. So the dendrogram allows us to view at once the clusters obtained for each possible number of clusters from 1 to n. So for the limit of time, we mainly focus on k-means clustering today. Now here's a dataset. So this is a simulated dataset with 150 observations in two-dimensional space. So panels show the results of applying k-means clustering with different numbers of k. So k is the number of clusters. So k equal to 2, k equal to 3, and k equal to 4. The color of each observation indicates the cluster to which it was assigned, by using the k-means clustering algorithm. So please note that there's no ordering of the clusters. So the cluster coloring is arbitrary. So these cluster labels were not used in clustering. Instead, they are the outputs of the clustering procedure. Now suppose we have k clusters, C1 to Ck. So here, for those k clusters, we assume that the union of C1, C2 to Ck is all the data points. But the intersection of two clusters in C1 to Ck is empty. So in other words, each observation belongs to at least one of the k clusters, and the clusters are non-overlapping. So non-overlapping means no observations belong to more than one cluster. So the main idea behind K-means clustering is that a good clustering is one for which the within cluster variation is as small as possible. So what is a good clustering? The clustering is that if we define the within cluster variation, so a good K-means clustering is to minimize this within cluster variation. That is roughly speaking, the elements in the same cluster should be as similar as possible, and elements in different clusters should not be very similar, Now the point is, how can we define the within cluster variation? So typically, we use Euclidean distance to measure the similarity of elements in the same cluster. That is, for example, if we have xi prime to be two elements in cluster CK. So how to measure the similarity of those 2 points? That is, we can take the Euclidean distance between the 2 points. Okay, Euclidean distance. The Euclidean distance. Now, because each element has p features, so the Euclidean distance is defined as this formula. Here, the CK absolute value of CK is the number of elements in cluster CK. Okay, and then we take the summation. So this is our objective function for K-means clustering, and we try to minimize this objective function. So the algorithm to minimize this objective function is very interesting. The initial step is to randomly assign a number from 1 to k to each of the observations. So this is an initial cluster assignments for the observations, and then we do iteration. So in the iteration, firstly, we compute the cluster centroid for each of the k clusters. So why we do this, we will explain later. And the k cluster centroid is the vector of p features, p feature means for the observations in the case cluster. And then we assign each observation to the cluster whose center is the closest. So here the closest, I mean the Euclidean distance. So why this is very useful, that is, mathematically speaking. We have this identity. We have this identity. So that is, we compute the centroid for the case cluster, and then we assign each observation to the center whose centroid is closest. In this way, we can minimize this objective function. So you can see first we compute the centroid, and then we assign each observation to the closest centroid. So this can minimize this distance. So in this way, we can minimize the within cluster variation. Now we look at those plots. And in this way, we can see this algorithm is guaranteed to decrease the value of the within cluster variation. Now we look at those pictures. So in step 1, each observation is randomly assigned to a cluster. Here we choose k equal to 3. And then the cluster centroids are computed. So the centroids are shown as large colored disks. So initially, the centroids are almost completely overlapping because the initial cluster assignments were chosen at random. And then each observation is assigned to the nearest centroid. So in this way, we can minimize, we can decrease the within cluster variation. And then we do this again and again until no further change. Then we can stop. So normally speaking, it will stop after 10 iterations or more than or 20 iterations. Okay. So now there's some problem with k-means clustering. Sometimes when we run the k-means clustering, what we find out is the local optimums. So look at those plots. So this is k-means clustering performed 6 times on the data, each time with a different random assignment of the observations. So above each plot is the within cluster variation. You can see 3 different local optima were obtained. So for this plot, we have a very big within cluster variation. For this plot, we also have a very big within cluster variation. But for those 4 plots, the within cluster variation is the minimum. That means we achieve the algorithm achieve the best solution in those 4 experiments. And you can see the result is very good for those 4 plots. So this tells us that it is essential to run the algorithm multiple times with random starting points to find a better solution. So another disadvantage of k-means clustering is that maybe you already figure out that the k-means, maybe you already discovered that the k-means clustering requires us to pre-specify the number of clusters k. So this can be a disadvantage. But there are several strategies to find out the cluster number k. So you can see this is a bad solution and this is a good solution. So in practice, we can try several different choices of the number k and look for the one with a good solution. So there's no unique right answer. So generally speaking, most importantly, one must be careful about how to plan the results, how to interpret the results of clustering analysis. So these results should not be taken as the absolute truth about a dataset. This can only be taken as a starting point for further study.